Picture England in the 16th century, a time when the world was pretty much lit by candles and fires. Once the sun dipped below the horizon, the streets outside turned pitch black. Believe it or not, London wouldn't see streetlights for another 100 years. In such deep darkness, people didn't need to conjure up monsters, they simply accepted their existence, just like they accepted rain, hunger, or even the king. Ghosts roamed around, and demons lurked in the shadows, and somewhere between heaven and hell, the dead weren't quite done with the living. This isn't just a tale about a single ghost or a haunted house. It's about an entire nation that coexisted with the supernatural on a daily basis. And instead of kicking things off with a spooky story, it starts with one big question that seemed to stump everyone for an entire century. What exactly is a ghost? For a good chunk of the Tudor era, things seemed pretty straightforward. England was firmly Catholic, and the church had this belief that when people died, they didn't just head straight to heaven or hell. Instead, most souls went to purgatory first, a sort of waiting room where they could get cleaned up before entering paradise. So if someone saw a ghost, it made total sense. That spirit could be a soul caught in between worlds, coming back to ask the living for prayers, a bit of kindness, or to tie up some loose ends. Helping out a ghost wasn't scary at all. It felt more like an obligation. Then came the Reformation. Henry VIII decided he was done with Rome and broke away from it. His kids kept flipping the country's religious beliefs. One minute England was Protestant under one ruler, then Catholic under another, and back again. This meant you could be born into one belief about what happens after death and grow old believing something completely different without ever leaving your hometown. The Protestant view tossed purgatory right out the window. If souls went straight to their final destination as soon as they died, no waiting room allowed, then ghosts couldn't possibly be those souls returning. So what exactly was haunting those hallways at night? It is worth pausing on how unsettling that single change really was. For generations, families had grown up believing that if something pale and familiar appeared at the foot of the bed, the kind thing to do was to listen to it, to pray for it, to help it on its way. Within the space of one lifetime, that same pale shape was being described from the pulpit as something to fear instead, something that wanted to be let in rather than helped along. The dead had not changed. The rules about what to do when they returned had changed completely, and nobody could be entirely certain which set of rules was the right one to trust. While scholars argued about souls and demons in their books, ordinary families were doing something far more practical. They were trying to keep the dark out of their own homes, and they were watching for warnings everywhere they looked. A comet crossing the night sky was never just a comet. It was a sign, a warning written across the heavens that something terrible was coming, whether sickness, war, or the death of someone important. A flock of black birds circling overhead was read the same way. An owl calling after dark, a strange dog appearing on a doorstep, a hare crossing a lonely path, none of these were dismissed as simple chance. They were messages, and a wise household paid attention to them. Even small accidents carried weight. A mirror cracking for no reason, or a picture slipping off a wall and shattering on the floor, was taken as a quiet warning that misfortune was already on its way, whether anyone wanted to believe it or not. Some of these old habits never really left. Saying a blessing after someone sneezes, to stop something unwelcome slipping in through an open mouth, throwing a pinch of spilled salt over the left shoulder, refusing to walk beneath a leaning ladder, refusing to leave a pair of shoes sitting on a table. These small, almost forgotten habits are the last fading echoes of a world where every careless little accident might be a door left open to something else. Beneath the floorboards of more than one Tudor house, builders and archaeologists have found small stoneware jars, sealed and buried with care, exactly where no one would ever think to dig. Inside one, found beneath a street in Greenwich in 2004, sealed so tightly its cork was still in place after more than 3 centuries underground. Researchers discovered bent iron nails, brass pins, a scrap of human hair, fingernail clippings, and traces left behind by the bottle's long-dead owner. It is what historians call a witch bottle, built for one purpose only. If a witch had placed a curse on a household, the bottle was meant to catch that curse and throw it straight back at her. Other homes hid different kinds of protection. Old, worn-out shoes were tucked into chimney breasts and sealed inside walls, left there on purpose to trap or confuse whatever evil might try to slip into the house through smoke or stone. In at least one London house, searchers found something stranger still. The dried bodies of cats, deliberately sealed inside the walls themselves, placed there as silent guardians against whatever unseen things might be listening on the other side. And then there are the marks, carved quietly into wooden beams, door frames, and the stone around fireplaces. Small symbols still survive in old buildings today, put there by hands that have been dust for 400 years. A 6-petaled flower, drawn in one continuous, looping line, meant to trap a wandering spirit the moment it tried to follow the pattern with its eye. Overlapping letters calling on protection from above, deliberate burn marks, scorched into wood on purpose, fire used to fight off whatever the people of that house feared more than fire itself. There was even a way to deal with death itself once it finally arrived. In some households, a stranger was paid a small fee to sit beside a corpse and eat a piece of bread, washed down with ale that had been passed directly over the body. By eating that simple meal, the stranger was believed to take on the sins of the dead person, freeing their soul to leave in peace, untroubled by guilt it might otherwise carry into whatever waited next. To modern ears, it sounds like a strange transaction. To Tudor minds, sin itself was treated almost like a physical weight, something that really could be lifted off one person's shoulders and placed onto another's, carried away with nothing more than a meal eaten in silence beside the dead. Not every fear could be carved into a doorframe and left behind. Some followed a family for generations and grew into something far harder to prove or disprove. In the old abbey grounds of Bisham Abbey in Berkshire, the story still told today is of a woman in grey, drifting silently through halls that once belonged to a clever, well-read noblewoman of the late 1500s named Elizabeth Hoby. She does not simply walk. Witnesses, who claim to have seen her, describe something closer to a photograph, turned inside out. Her face and hands dark where they should be pale, her gown pale where it should be dark, endlessly washing her hands over a basin that floats just ahead of her, as though trying to clean away a stain that will not come off. The story passed down alongside her ghost is a brutal one, that she once struck a young son of hers so hard for blotting his schoolwork that the boy died from it, and that his ruined, ink-stained copybooks were later found hidden inside the very walls of the house. Other old Tudor houses tell quieter versions of the same kind of story. At Rufford Old Hall in Lancashire, a timber-framed house built in the early 1500s for the Hesketh family, visitors speak of a grey lady said to be Elizabeth Hesketh, said to have died of a broken heart while her husband was away at war, never given the chance to say goodbye before the end came. She is usually seen near the great fireplace, and is said to vanish the moment anyone tries to approach her directly. Not far from where she walks, a second figure is sometimes reported, a man in old-fashioned dress, lingering close to a hidden room built into the house long ago. The kind of small, concealed space once used to shelter a priest during years when practicing the wrong faith openly could cost a family everything. Further south, at Sawston Hall in Cambridgeshire, the story is tied to a real and dangerous moment in history. In 1553, the Huddleston family sheltered a noblewoman fleeing for her life during the chaos that followed the death of a young king, hiding her from soldiers sent to find her before she could claim the throne that was rightfully hers. She survived, went on to become queen, and rewarded the family by having Sawston Hall rebuilt after it was burned in the unrest that followed. Guests there still report a soft, deliberate knock, 3 times against a door, just before something unseen seems to pass straight through the wood. Overnight visitors who have stayed in the room, connected to her memory, describe restless nights, faint scratching sounds, and the unmistakable feeling of not being entirely alone, even with every door locked and every light extinguished. None of these stories were written down at the time the houses were new. They surface much later, told by housekeepers, guests, and visitors long after the people they describe were gone. Whether that makes them less true or only less proven is something each listener has to decide for themselves. What do you think? Let me know your views in the comments. While royals supposedly haunted castles, normal folks had to deal with much noisier and more annoying spirits in their small cottages. Long before the word poltergeist was common, Tudor families complained of horrid ghosts and dreadful spirits wrecking their homes. Noisy neighbours. Haunted houses were plagued by the sounds of heavy footsteps, rattling chains, loud groaning, and slamming doors. People also reported sudden, terrible smells like rotten eggs or sulphur, which they called a brimstone stink. Flying furniture. Ghosts of the common folk loved to mess with household chores. Spirits were reported to throw pewter plates across kitchens, pull all the blankets off sleeping families in the middle of the night, and even make heavy salt barrels march from one room to another on their own. The wig snatcher. In one bizarre account from 1680, a ghost got highly offended by the trendy long wigs that young men wore. The spirit reportedly went around tearing the wigs right off the men's heads in a violent, invisible struggle. To deal with these pests, ordinary people often ignored the church and went straight to local cunning folk, ordinary town magicians. These magic practitioners would visit the house, draw magic chalk circles on the floor, burn juniper wood, and use special wax candles to try and trap or bind the spirit so it would leave the family alone. When normal folks encountered spirits, the stories were often printed on cheap single-sheet papers called broadsides or pamphlets, which were sold on street corners for a penny. Here are some of the most famous and spooky recorded tales from the everyday people of the Tudor era. One of the most famous ghost legends among ordinary people was captured in the folk ballad The Unquiet Grave. In this story, a young peasant man is so heartbroken over the death of his lover that he sits and weeps on her grave for a year and a day. Finally, the ghost of the girl speaks to him directly from beneath the dirt. She complains that his constant, heavy grieving will not let her sleep. She warns him that if he kisses her cold, decaying lips, his own life will be cut short, and he will join her in the earth. The tale was a warning to peasants that too much grief could disturb the dead and draw the living into an early grave. In 1575, a simple malt maker, which is someone who makes ingredients for beer, living near Northampton, was walking home in the dark when he was confronted by a terrifying spirit. The ghost appeared in a familiar and human shape and blocked his path. In an eerie, hollow voice, the spirit confessed that he was the ghost of a man who had been brutally murdered 267 years, 9 weeks, and 2 days earlier. Now that is very precise. The ghost explained that he had been trapped and bound down by the magic spell of a Catholic friar for 250 of those years. Now that the spell had worn off, he was free to roam the earth again, looking for someone to help him find his hidden bones so he could finally get a proper Christian burial. In 1598, a popular pamphlet titled Green in Conceit was published in London. It detailed a spooky encounter with the ghost of a well-known writer named Robert Greene, who had recently died in poverty. The pamphlet featured a creepy illustration of Greene's ghost returning from the dead to speak to the living. True to the beliefs of the common folk, his spirit did not look like a glowing angel or a vaporous mist. Instead, he appeared wrapped head to toe in his tight, white linen burial shroud, looking exactly like a corpse that had just stepped out of its grave. Normal folks did not just fear human ghosts, they also lived in terror of familiar spirits, demons sent by witches in the shape of ordinary household animals to torment the neighbourhood. In 1566, a highly popular pamphlet reported on a famous court trial in Chelmsford, Essex. 3 local women confessed to keeping a familiar spirit they named Sathan. Sathan first appeared to them as a white, spotted cat. The women confessed that in exchange for drops of their blood, the cat would use dark magic to ruin their neighbours' lives. It allegedly killed local children, ruined crops, made cows sick, and made several local men very ill. Later on, the spirit reportedly changed its shape into a toad, and finally into a black dog with the face of an ape, horns on its head, and a short tail. This trial terrified the public, making ordinary people look at every stray cat or dog with deep suspicion. Strip away the grey ladies and the floating basins, and what remains is something stranger than any single ghost story. An entire country, caught between two faiths, never quite settling on what waited for them after death, or what might still be walking the halls long after the candles were put out. They buried bottles full of nails beneath their own front doors. They scratched flowers into their beams to trap something they could not name. They sealed cats into walls to guard rooms that, 400 years later, people still hesitate to enter alone at night. Maybe none of it worked. Or maybe it is still working, quietly, in the dark corners of houses that are still standing, their old marks worn smooth, their old questions never answered. What were they really protecting themselves from? Nobody ever wrote that part down.